It was the middle of a long warm spell in the early spring of 1947, when the Springhouse still looked clear as glass water. The dirt floor stayed damp the way it always had, and the old stone walls held that cool breath that made a man believe the winter stores were safe. The family had put away their cabbages and their potatoes and their apples the autumn before the way their neighbors said was right, and they had checked the smell more than once. Nothing seemed off. The water ran steady from the spring, and the air inside felt the same as it had in every cold month. Then one evening the mother pulled a head of cabbage for supper, and the leaves that looked firm on the outside gave way soft and sour underneath. By the next week the potatoes had that sweet rot that spreads through a bin without a sound, and the apples that had kept all winter turned brown at the core. It was not the weather that hurt them, and it was not any animal that got inside. It was the myth they had trusted about how a Springhouse could ride out a warm spell without a single change in the way the food was watched. My name is Rufus Red Harlan. I am 7th generation on this holler in the Ozarks. My grandfather raised me after the hard years and made me copy every rule about cold storage into a leather journal before he passed. He walked me through the Springhouses and the dugout cellars and the dirt floor rooms until I could feel the difference between honest damp and the kind that turns food against a family. I never left these hills, and I have seen the same quiet losses happen over and over when people trust what looks safe instead of what the old men actually did. Today I will walk you through every piece of the real method the way those old men practiced it, including the one step that was quietly taken out of the books. This knowledge did not fade because it stopped working. It faded because the people who still held it grew fewer, and the myths that looked easier took its place. If you want the buried cold storage skills brought back into daylight, then subscribe. The next ones will matter to anyone who still keeps food in the ground or in a Springhouse. There are 6 clear pieces to the way the old Ozark families kept their Springhouses from turning against them after a warm spell, and I will take them in order. The first piece is the way they read the water itself. Most people today walk into a Springhouse after a stretch of mild weather, and they look at the surface of the trough or the little pool, and if it is still moving and still clear, they decide everything is fine. The old men never stopped there. They would kneel down and put a hand into the water and feel for the temperature against their own blood. They knew that a spring that had run cold all winter could rise 2 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit after only a few days of warm air, and that small rise was enough to change the way moisture moved through the air inside the house. They would hold a clean white rag under the flow and let it soak. Then they would smell that rag the way a man smells a fresh dug potato. If there was even a hint of earth that had gone sweet or of stone that had gone soft, they knew the water had begun to carry the wrong kind of damp. They would then open every vent and every door for a measured time so the warmer air could move through and out again before it settled into the food. Families who skipped that simple feel of the water and that short airing lost their cabbage first, because cabbage holds moisture in its leaves the way a sponge holds it, and once the air turned the leaves began to break down from the inside. The reason the rule exists is simple. Water temperature is the first messenger of change, and the old men trusted their hands more than their eyes. The second piece is the dirt floor and the way it was kept. People now think a dirt floor that stays damp is always a good sign because it means the air is cool. That is the myth that cost more stores than any other. The old Ozark families kept the floor damp on purpose, but they controlled the kind of damp. They would sprinkle a thin layer of wood ash mixed with a little lime across the packed earth every few weeks during the cold months. The ash took up the free water that wanted to rise, and the lime kept the soil from going sour. After a warm spell, they would sweep that layer carefully into a bucket and look at the color. If the ash had turned dark and clumped, they knew the floor had taken on more moisture than the food could bear. They would then dig a shallow trench along the low side of the floor and let the extra water move out toward the spring run for a day or two. Only after that would they put down a fresh, thin layer. Most people today leave the same damp floor untouched for the whole winter, and when the warm air comes, the moisture rises straight into the bins. The potatoes that sat closest to the ground were the first to show that sweet rot, and once it started, it moved through the whole pile. The honest limit here is that a dirt floor will always hold some water. The old method never tried to make it dry as bone. It only kept the free water from climbing into the food. Families who believed the myth that damp was always safe watched their winter stores turn against them, while the floor still looked the same as it had in January. The third piece is the wood that held the shelves and the bins. The old men chose only certain woods, and they knew the difference by smell and by the way the grain took the damp. They used white oak that had been cut in the winter and seasoned under cover for at least one full year. They never used pine or any soft wood that still carried the scent of resin, because that scent would mix with the moisture and settle into the food. After a warm spell, they would walk the shelves with a clean hand and press their palm flat against the underside of each board. If the wood felt cooler than the air and still dry to the touch, they left it. If it felt clammy, they would pull the food off that shelf and set the boards outside in the shade for a full day so the sun and the moving air could pull the moisture out. Then they would bring the boards back and rub a thin coat of clean lard into the grain before they put the food on again. People now build shelves out of whatever lumber is cheap, and they leave them year after year without ever checking the underside. When the warm spell comes, the wood holds the extra damp the way a cloth holds it, and the food closest to the shelf begins to sweat. The apples that touched those boards were the ones that went brown at the core first. The reason for the rule is that wood is not neutral. It either protects the food or it feeds the rot, and the old men never trusted a shelf they had not tested with their own hand. The fourth piece is the smell test that went deeper than most people ever bother with. After any stretch of mild weather, the old men would take a clean wooden spoon and dig into the middle of a potato bin or a cabbage crate and bring up a piece from the center. They would break it open and hold it close to the nose for a full, slow breath. They were not looking for the sharp sour that everyone can smell. They were looking for the quiet sweet that comes before the sour. That sweet is the first sign that the cells inside the food have begun to break down, and once it is present, the rest of the bin is already on the way. They would also take a handful of the packing material, whether it was dry leaves or clean sand, and smell that the same way. If the packing had taken on any sweetness, they would empty the whole bin and sort every piece by hand in the open air. Most families today open the Springhouse door and take one quick sniff from the doorway and decide everything is fine because they do not catch the sharp rot yet. By the time the sharp smell arrives, the stores are already lost. The honest limit of this method is that the sweet stage can be very faint, and a man who has been around strong smells all day may miss it the first time. That is why the old men did the test more than once, and why they used a wooden spoon that held no other scent. Families who trusted the doorway sniff alone found themselves eating the last of the good food, while the rest of the winter still stretched ahead. The fifth piece is the timing of the airing and the way the vents were handled. The old men never left the Springhouse sealed tight through a warm spell. They watched the sky and the temperature the way a farmer watches a field. When the air outside stayed above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, for more than 2 days they would open the upper vents at first light and leave them open until the sun was well up. Then they would close those vents and open the lower ones for a short time so any heavier damp air could move out toward the spring run. They timed the openings so that the warmest part of the day did not push new heat inside. They also kept a simple cloth hung near the main door, and they would feel that cloth every morning. If it stayed cool and dry, they knew the airing had done its work. If it felt damp, they would air the house again the next day. People now either leave everything closed for fear of letting in flies, or they throw the doors wide open for hours at a time and let the warm air settle deep into the bins. Both mistakes cost stores. The closed house traps the rising moisture, and the wide open house brings in more heat than the spring can cool. The old method used short, measured openings that moved the air without letting the temperature climb. The honest limit is that a spring house will always follow the weather to some degree. No amount of careful airing can keep the inside colder than the spring itself when the outside air stays warm for weeks. The families who understood that limit still saved most of their food because they acted early instead of waiting for the smell of rot. The sixth piece is the packing and the way the food itself was arranged after the warm spell. The old men never left the bins the way they had been stacked in the fall. Once the weather turned mild, they would go through every layer and pull out any piece that showed even a small soft spot. They would set those pieces aside for immediate use, and they would rebuild the bins with more space between the layers. They used clean, dry leaves from the white oak or from the hickory, and they made sure the leaves were not packed tight. The extra airspace let the moisture move away from the food instead of sitting against it. They also kept a thin layer of clean sand under the lowest potatoes, and they checked that sand for damp after the warm days. If the sand had begun to clump, they would replace it. Most people today leave the bins exactly as they filled them in October, and they only dig into the top layer when they need food. The lower layers sit in the rising damp, and the rot starts there and works its way up. By the time the family notices the top is soft, the bottom is already gone. The reason the old men rebuilt the bins is simple. Food that has been through a warm spell needs more room to breathe, and the packing that worked in deep cold will hold too much moisture once the air changes. Families who skipped this step watched whole bins go bad, while the food on top still looked firm. When you put all 6 pieces together, you begin to see why some families ate through the hard winters and others did not. The ones who checked the water with their hands and kept the floor ash clean and tested the wood and smelled the center of the bins and aired the house in short measured times and rebuilt the packing after every warm spell still had food when the next cold came. The ones who trusted the look of clear water and the feel of a damp floor and the quick doorway sniff lost their stores quietly while everything still seemed safe. That is the emotional cost of the myth. A family can work all summer and all fall and fill the spring house with the best of the harvest and still watch it turn against them in a single stretch of mild weather, because they believed the house would take care of itself. The complete system of these methods, and many more that belong to the same old knowledge, is collected in the Ozark Cold Storage Codex. Over 100 pages, $19. The $19 price is only for the first 300 copies. After 300 copies, the price rises permanently and never returns. The link is in the description below this video. Now I will finish the last of the teaching so you have the full picture. The final critical step is the one that was quietly left out of most of the written accounts. After every warm spell, the old men would take a small amount of clean wood ash and a smaller amount of lime, and they would mix them with just enough spring water to make a thin paste. They would then take a clean cloth and wipe a light coat of that paste along the lower stone walls and along the edges of the dirt floor where the wall met the ground. They let it dry for a full day with the vents open. The ash and lime pulled the last of the free moisture out of the stone and the soil, and they left a thin barrier that slowed the next rise of damp. They never used more than a thin coat because too much would leave a sharp taste in the air. They never mixed the paste thick because a thick coat would crack and fall away. The ratio was simple: 3 parts clean ash to 1 part lime, and enough water to make it spread like thin cream. They did this only after the warm spell had passed and the nights had cooled again. Families who skipped this step could do everything else right and still lose food in the next mild stretch because the walls and the floor edges kept holding the moisture from the earlier warm days. The ones who took the time to wipe that thin paste were the ones whose springhouses stayed honest through the rest of the season. That is the step that separates the families who ate through winter from the ones who did not. It is quiet work, and it leaves no mark that a stranger would notice, but it is the difference between stores that last and stores that turn. The honest limit of the whole method is that a springhouse is still bound to the land and the weather. If the spring itself begins to fail, or if a long drought drops the flow, the house cannot stay as cold as it should. No amount of ash or careful airing can replace water that is no longer there. The old men knew that, and they kept a second smaller dugout ready for the years when the spring ran low. They also knew that some foods simply will not hold past a certain point, no matter how careful the storage. Soft summer apples and early potatoes were always used first. The method was never magic. It was careful work repeated every time the weather changed. And it worked because the families treated the springhouse as a living place that needed watching, rather than a box that could be left alone. So here is what I want you to do. Walk out to your own cold storage, whether it is a springhouse or a dugout or a simple dirt floor room, and put your hand into the water or against the floor and feel what is really there. Check the underside of every shelf with a clean palm. Dig into the center of one bin and smell what the middle holds. Mix a small batch of 3 parts ash to 1 part lime with spring water and wipe a thin coat along the lower walls after the next warm spell. The total material cost is less than the price of a single good meal if you already have the ash and the lime from the wood stove and the garden. Leave a comment and tell me what the center of your bin smelled like the last time you checked it after a stretch of mild weather. I read every single one of these. The complete system is in the Ozark Cold Storage Codex. Over 100 pages, $19. The $19 price is only for the first 300 copies. After 300 copies, the price rises permanently and never returns. The link is in the description below this video. Keep the vents timed to the morning cool, and never trust a floor that looks the same after a warm spell. The families who ate through the hard winters knew these things by heart, and that knowledge is still waiting for anyone willing to take it back.